Segue. To continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue. To make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue. To perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue. To make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello, everybody. Dr. Kiana Cox was born in Chicago, Illinois. She obtained her bachelor's in science in psychology and her master's degree in sociology from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and her doctorate in sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Today, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, her alma mater. Welcome to Segue, Dr. Cox.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We're talking about sociology, and I'm sure our audience have heard the term. Everybody has heard the term. But I wonder how many people really know what sociology is all about. So I wanted to ask you to explain to our audience, what is a sociologist doing in terms of his or her work?
That's actually a really good question because I start all of my sociology classes making sure that my students understand that. First and foremost, sociology is the study of human social life. And in that regard, it makes it different from other social sciences. So psychology, the study of human mental life. Anthropology, sort of the study of human physical life and artifacts. But sociology is how human beings exist, interact with one another in groups. And then the most important thing to me, specifically about sociology, is the extent to which sociology is a science. So we don't just kind of pontificate about what people do in groups, we study it. So human beings and the social world are our laboratory. So we take as our subjects people and how they interact with one another.
But you started to study psychology, which is about behavior. And I'm sure that they are both related to each other because of, after all, behavior of humans as a group is a combination of individual behavior and something more. So tell us a little bit about why you got interested in sociology, given that your initial interest seems to be in psychology.
I got interested in sociology because psychology didn't give me enough of the picture that I needed to explain the world in the ways that I needed it explained to me. So psychology taught me a lot about human behavior from the mental aspect. Sociology allowed me to incorporate understandings about law, history, and politics, definitely, so that you have layers of analysis on top of human behavior. Because psychological experiences, human behavior always exists in a broader social context. So psychology would be on what we call the micro level. So how people interact, who do they believe themselves to be, their identity, their interaction. Sociology exists on bigger levels. So those people, their identity, their interactions exist in neighborhoods, in institutions, in relationship to governments, in relationship to culture, in relationship to ideology. So all of those things are what make sociology sort of the social aspect of it. And that's what I needed to be able to understand.
Now, within sociology, you have specialized on issues of race and gender. Why is that?
Well, some of it, I don't want to call it selfish, but certainly personal interests. I wanted to be able to understand not only where Black people fit in the social world and to be able to explain, again, from sort of that legal, historical, political aspect, where Black people fit in the world and in the United States, but also as I progressed through graduate school to understand how the experiences of Black women differed from Black men. So those were where my interests lay. And then to see sort of the differing levels of sort of inequality within inequality for Black women, that's where my interests came from. That's where my interest got piqued. I wanted to know why within this context were black women worse off in some cases than black men were.
Now, there are many people who believe in racial equality, there are many people who believe in gender equality, but I have the impression that the ones who believe in either of those don't necessarily believe in both. Is that what your experience?
So there are people who believe in both. So within sort of the study of gender and sexuality studies, we call it intersectionality. It's the idea that our identities sit not just as race or as gender, but as both at the same time. And then as a host of other social locations at the same time. What you find, though, in the movements around those things, so what you find historically within anti-racist movements, particularly black anti-racist movements, were efforts to shore up black unity at the expense of black complexity. So we won't deal with gender, we won't deal with sexuality. We have to deal with issues of our blackness first. And so historically that has been the sort of the sticking point for black women who were in those movements. I was teaching a class on this morning, and we were talking about black women during the 60s and the 70s who were in the Black Panther Party, who wanted to be leaders in the movement, who wanted to do more than bake the cookies or help the kids in the lunch program. They wanted to be leaders, and they were told that your place is in the home. So certainly within anti-racist movements, the need to address gender was there, but was suppressed in favor of racial interests. And then black women saw similar trends within the feminist movement. So their issues as black women, how does race impact their status as women, was not addressed in those movements either.
Now, I have heard that the issue that you mentioned first, equality in race but not equality in gender, is something that is also being experienced in some black churches today.
Okay.
Why is that?
Equality in terms of race and not gender in churches. I think there are a couple of layers to it. So one, if you look at sort of just the gender dynamic in Protestant Christianity, and probably Christianity in terms of Catholicism. I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant as well. So, but definitely within Protestant Christianity, and you look at the ways that women are talked about in the Bible as wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Husbands, you are the head of the church as Christ is the head. So if you read the Bible on the surface level, you get a very strict gender division of labor in terms of what women should do, be, how they ought to look, how they ought to be treated. And so, of course, you see that then mapped onto churches as they practice Christianity. Aside from that, if you also think about the link that black churches and religion have had to black liberation movements, and the idea that men are the head of the race and not just the head of the church, that men are head of families and, again, not just head of the church. So you have sort of at least two layers of religion and the Bible and sort of how black politics ought to be that map onto one another, and that and in both of those, women are not viewed or even encouraged to be leaders. Now, that's not across the board, certainly. There are certainly lots of particularly Protestant denominations where women are pastors, or non-denominational churches where women are pastors, women are bishops, women are lead congregations. So it's not all the way across the board, but you still have that sort of Christian ideology that women are at least one peg below men.
Now, many people say, and I wanted to know your opinion about this, that of all the segments of American society, probably black women are the ones who have suffered the most, the ones who have been most humiliated because of both race and gender. Do you agree with that?
I don't know that I would say suffered the most in terms of, I don't know that I would...
In terms of equality and opportunities.
I would say people of color who exist at sort of the combination or the intersection of lots of marginalized identities. So black women being an example of that, but also queer people of color, and not just black people, but Latino people, Asian people, people from the Caribbean, people from the continent of Africa, or what we call the global South. Generally people who sit at the bottom of societies are people who inhabit multiple marginalized identities. So I don't know that I would say black women specifically are worse off than other people. I would broaden it and say that you would see among people of color who have multiple marginalized identities, that those people tend to be worse off.
Right now we have an African American president.
Okay.
People are talking about the possibility that we may have a woman president
Okay.
in the next election. But you don't see that many African American women in positions of political leadership in this country. And I was wondering if don't we need more of them in order to make that prospect of having good role models among the African American community for women present across society? Do you think that we need more of those leaders around?
Do I think we need more? I think more would be good, but I personally always am cautious in when we talk about sort of this symbolic representation. So I think we make a mistake if we assume that sort of the cursory presence of a black woman in power necessarily advances equality. Certainly it can be evidence of advancements, but I don't know that just getting to that step is enough for, and then once we get there, kind of what is the public reaction to it. So Michelle Obama, although she was not elected to her office, and certainly she is not the person in power, but as First Lady, she certainly has a platform. And lots of black women have looked up to her as certainly a familiar icon. Lots of women view her as sort of, I can relate to her. She's a real black woman, in ways that people sort of feel familiar with her. But she has been critiqued in that role by feminists who argue, oh, you're not supposed to stay at home with your children. You're supposed to go out and be this sort of, as they say, this kick-butt feminist with your Harvard education and your law degree. You're supposed to do more for us as opposed to what you're doing. So I think the prospect of having a black woman in power opens up some critiques that you wouldn't expect, like those of Michelle Obama. But certainly I think it would be a first step, but I don't know that we could argue that having somebody in place just by virtue of their identity necessarily makes things better. I mean, Clarence Thomas would be an example of that. There we have sort of symbolic representation where he took Thurgood Marshall's seat, but we would never argue that Clarence Thomas was as progressive or, about racial equality in the way that Thurgood Marshall had been throughout his career. So that's sort of the downside of sort of symbolic representation.
Okay. I mean, and I was asking that question because obviously in the case of Michelle Obama, one wonders if she has purposely assumed a less prominent role by the fact of the very nature of the reaction that happened in this country after President Obama was elected.
Okay.
Because before was heralded as a big achievement for the society, but you could see that the reaction in many quarters wasn't that good.
Backlash.
A lot of the criticisms toward him, you can assign it to what it had to do with his race, with his politics, because nobody can tell that Obama is a radical leftist or anything like that. So
I don't think anybody would accuse him of that.
Sometimes some African American women are more careful in their public persona to avoid that kind of reaction.
Right. I think some of it has to do with this sort of stereotype of what Patricia Hill Collins, she does work on images of black women, what she would call the sapphire, or it's the idea that black women are inherently angry, always angry, that they emasculate men, that if they get control, it's too much control, it's an aggressive, abrasive type of control. And so I do think that women in general are subject to those critiques, that if they are in power, they are accused of being, oh, she's too much, she's trying to be a man. But black women specifically, because of our racial history in the United States and the idea that black people are sort of, or the racist stereotype that black people are uncontrollable, you map gender onto that. Oh, she's an angry black woman, she has too much power and she wants to crush everybody. So I do think that's one aspect of of Michelle Obama perhaps would be an aspect of her. But if you listen to what she says, her argument is that now that her husband is president, now she gets to be more of a mom. So if you listen to her, she talks about her public persona as being mom in chief. And this is one of the things that she was criticized for by contemporary feminists. Just not even a year ago, in a Politico article, they called Michelle Obama a feminist nightmare because she, in her words, chose to be mom in chief. So she had her mother moved into the White House with her. She wanted to keep her daughters' lives as normal as possible because of how young they were when they moved there. So I think that to say that she doesn't have more of a voice because of the angry black woman stereotype, I think that may be part of it. But if you listen to her own words, for her it was a protective family decision to not be in the spotlight as much.
And I think, it is an unfair criticism of her because to have two kids at that age, being African Americans, growing up in the White House with all the spotlight about it, I think they need a protective mother.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you have no idea what kind of exposure they may have to very nasty stuff.
Right. And like you said, once the tide changed, and it kind of has never been back at the height that it was during the first election cycle. Certainly, if you can, the guy who just leaped over the White House fence with guns and knives and things. So certainly there's a level of heightened scrutiny and danger that we haven't seen with other presidents.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about, because I know you have worked in this area, of how the media portray African American women.
Okay.
And it is interesting because what you said about the angry black woman is a stereotype that is there. You see on television, in movies.
Yep.
No question about that.
And often in comedic roles, too.
Exactly. On the other hand, when you look at one of the first African American TV shows that was very successful, The Jeffersons.
Okay.
It was the opposite. The women look very, the African American women look very rational, very calm.
And they were wealthy.
Is kind of the media exploiting stereotypes for the sake of ratings?
In today's media, I would argue yes. So on cable music channels specifically, there is a whole new reality genre, I would argue, that's built up on the stereotype of angry, violent black women. Love and Hip Hop Atlanta, Love and Hip Hop Hollywood, The Real Housewives of Atlanta. So certainly there are several shows across several cable networks. Basketball Wives LA, there and all of their spinoffs that thrive on the idea that black women are vicious and angry and violent towards one another. So yes, I think there is certainly an industry and a market for that.
The other issue that I see also with the portrait of African American women has to do with hip hop, as you mentioned earlier, rap and all that kind of things. Where you see a sexualization of the African American woman, and I wonder if the people who play those roles in those videos are really conscious of what they're doing, if the producers of those videos are really conscious about what they're doing, and the bad image that generates, especially as a bad example for many other African American women.
I think I just had a conversation about this with my students in my, I teach a class on black politics, black history, and black feminism on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. And we had a similar conversation this morning about the rapper Nicki Minaj. And I think there are different levels to that. So I think there are, of course, people who are, I don't want to say opportunists, but people who want to be in videos, they want that kind of career, they want that kind of lifestyle. And so they're video girls. They get hired for a job. There are other women who are dancers, like classically trained professional dancers. And because of racism within the dance industry in terms of classical ballet, modern dance, they take jobs where they can get them, and some of those jobs are in these types of videos. So some of that is the trade-off between, do I, stand for XYZ or do I work? And you see black actresses historically black actors in general make those types of negotiations. Do I perpetuate a stereotype in order for me to eat, in order for me to get a paycheck? So I think that's one level of it. I think the other level of it, particularly in hip hop, is, for me, an issue of agency. So who controls the image? It's not always men, and the image is not always one that is suitable for children. Particularly in the case of Nicki Minaj, there was an article written recently, I believe by Jamila Lemieux, who was an associate editor at Ebony Magazine, and she very simply said, Nicki Minaj is not for your daughters. And so on one level, I do think that hip-hop music is not for children in some aspects, and then even within that, I'm always interested to see to what extent do women, particularly female singers and female rappers, do they control how they are portrayed? And if they choose a sexualized image, to what extent are they in control of how that image is crafted? And often, for example, Nicki Minaj, Beyonce, they are very much in control of those types of images. So it's a lot of layers for me in terms of how those images are created and then what purpose they serve.
Now, you have in your classes both black students, white students. And I wonder what kind of differences, if any, you have noticed in the responses of kids from both races towards the same images from black women.
So,
do you see any difference in the way they interpret those images?
I think, so for example, we haven't looked at images of Nicki Minaj, we just discussed it sort of as a side topic this morning. But in that class in general, when we talk about black women and gender and racial inequality, for both black and white students, a lot of this history they don't know. They just don't know it. And so to show them or to expose to them the idea that Rosa Parks was not the first woman to be asked to move from her seat, and she wasn't. That it's not that the black students knew that history and the white students didn't. Neither one knew. And I'm finding that in my in that class in general, that there is a lot of American history that that's missing, and particularly black American history that's missing. So thus far, both groups of students tend to be, some of this is very new to them.
Now, in addition to the fact that they may not know that part of history, there's no question that African American history is part of American history, but has been kind of put on the side, the way the society works. Do you feel also that in our society today, at different levels, we are afraid to talk about race in public? And isn't that a problem?
I think it's a very interesting era that we're in now, that we talk about race without talking about it, or we talk about it as a way to insult people. So you're pulling the race card. Why are you putting race into places where it doesn't belong? That's one aspect of it. So people bring it up even in situations where it's not present, sort of like the angry black woman thing. You can be a black woman, you can say something and it'd be a very innocuous statement, and then, oh, you're angry. Why did you say it that way? And I think it's the same way when we talk about race. Oh, you made that racial, and it's not racial. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, and you see this politically, is where you have sort of coded language that has racial outcomes, but are not racial on the surface. So when we use words sort of like traditional, mainstream, American, we mean white. We generally mean white when we use words like that. Conversely, when we use words like underserved, minority, inner city, we saw this a lot with the this past summer with the children from the Jackie Robinson baseball team in Chicago, who I believe won the Little League, or came in second in the Little League World Series. And although some of those kids come from middle class families because they were black and they were from Chicago and from the South Side, those inner city kids, go inner city kids, win the World Series. And so that's an example of a way that we talk about race in ways that allow us to not say it. It's sort of the outcome of being politically correct.
Now, in addition to gender and race, I wonder if also you have noticed difference in terms of expression of identity at the generational level. And let me give you an example that I think everybody knows. I mean, among black males, the use of an N-word.
Okay.
Okay, young people use it all the time like nothing. And other people don't want to even touch it because they have a totally different meaning for them, how they went through. Do you find something different? I'm talking about the N-word, but in other aspects, in terms of different generations of American black women.
Different generations for American.
The attitude toward racial things.
I do. So I think one of the ways that you see this manifested is in what we call respectability politics. And sort of, kind of can go back to Nicki Minaj in this example in terms of media. Or Beyonce. So you see sort of older generation, and then some of this comes out of the civil rights movement too, where your black public face must be one that is demure and pulled together and very cultured and very, if not actually middle class, then certainly a portrayal of sort of middle class values and sensibilities. And so, and there are very political reasons for that, because some of the sort of racial ideology about how black people were to be equal in the early 20th century was, we must demonstrate that we are fit for equality. We must demonstrate that we can fit into American society now that we're free. So certainly there is a historical and political reason as to why respectability was sort of the order of the day. But now that we've gained that, you see, or gained some semblance of equality, the idea that we must be these respectable women who are asexual, who can wear an afro and it not be called ugly, or who can speak loud in public, who can stand up to certain things, who can push back against various ideas within black politics. Certainly you see, I think, younger generations of black women pushing back against this idea that we must be respectable and pulled together.
Don't call that the Jackie Robinson syndrome, right?
The Jackie Robinson syndrome.
To look respectable, not to create trouble.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Kiana Cox for this very interesting conversation about race and gender. Certainly, I had many more questions, but we ran out of time.
Okay.
The interview went very well. And next week, we're going to do an on-location recording about the Laboratory for Spatial Analysis at Southern Illinois University to talk about the future of geography. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.